Not a matter of if, but when crisis will rock your world. I'm Roshini Rajkumar, crisis strategist, licensed attorney, and host of The Crisis Files. In each case file, we explore a real-world crisis. My crisis squad and I seek solutions that help you avoid bigger problems. I also bring in experts who help solve those problems with a more thoughtful and crisis prevention approach. As General Counsel for Water Legacy, Paula Maaccabee has spent the past 14 years advocating for waterway protection in the state of Minnesota. She's here to help us understand how that fight impacts this life-giving resource nationwide in the case file I call Water Wars. Paula, much of your work with Water Legacy involves the impact of mining on water resources, such as the Great Lakes. What does mining have to do with our water?
What people don't realize is that of all the industries in all of America, the most toxic industry is the hard rock mining industry. And the United States Environmental Protection Agency studied which one results in the most costs, the most damage to water, and the answer was hard rock mining, which in Minnesota we call sulfide ore mining. And that means lead or nickel or copper or gold. This kind of mining is harmful to water, particularly in a water-rich environment, which is what we have in most of the Great Lakes states.
And is this kind of mining happening everywhere? Are there parts of the United States, in addition to the Great Lakes, that you're concerned about?
Absolutely. Some of the most toxic mines, copper mines in Utah or in Colorado, lithium mines in Nevada, and in Minnesota, it's a history of taconite mining and the proposal to do copper, nickel, and cobalt mining in Minnesota's water-rich environment. And that has also a threat now in Michigan. So this is a question, a crisis, I would say, for water all across America. And we have a really important choice to make. Do we take the short-term profitable solution of mining, or do we look long ahead and we realize that water is what sustains not only human life, but all of our ecosystems, and in the future, our children?
The long term isn't always that sexy. Let's talk about some stats. A 2020 World Bank report estimates some 3 billion tons of minerals and metals, like those sought in the Great Lakes region, will be needed to support alternative energy products like wind and solar between now and 2050. So there have been a lot of headlines about alternative sources. It seems like those also bring some challenges to our waterways.
Absolutely. And I think there's a rush that is being pushed by the very profitable industries that would do the mining to take one kind of solution, which is let's mine what we know now, lithium and nickel and cobalt and manganese, these very toxic metals, and let's do it right away. Whereas many of the researchers are now finding less toxic, more prevalent minerals like iron or sodium to be storage facilities for energy. So we can take the solution that looks good to the people who have the money now, or we can allow our economy to adopt diverse solutions, recycle our metal for now, and look for how do we do something that's sustainable. One thing I always laugh about is the people who come to me and they say, we need nickel. And then they come up with this absolutely enormous car that they're driving in the suburbs that is, in every sense of the word, not a climate sustainable solution. But they say, we need this right now. And maybe we do need some metals, but there are ways through recycling to solve part of the problem. And then there are cleaner and safer alternatives for the future. I guess in a balanced way, we need to look at it. What do we need right now? Where do we want to go? And what is the least harm way of getting there? And that might not rule out all mining, but it would rule out the mining that at least we've seen at Water Legacy, which is cheap and careless and located in the most vulnerable watersheds, often next to indigenous communities or low-income rural communities.
Okay, we hate cheap and careless on the Crisis Files, so you've really gotten my attention here. Okay, Paula, you make it sound like there are simple solutions, but I don't think there really are, right? So what can we do as consumers to do our part, but also maybe put some pressure on the manufacturing side?
As consumers, there are a few things we can do. One, we can consume less. I mean, if we're going to buy a car, do we really need a new one? Do we really need a very big, fast one that goes from 0 to 60 immediately? In our homes, do we have opportunities to use solar? Do we have opportunities to trade, share the buy nothing idea rather than always wanting the newest gadget? But we also need actually to ask our government to do what we talked about initially when America started this venture of capitalism, which is there are externalities that the company doesn't pay for. Clean air, clean water. These are externalities, and so regulation is needed to make sure that the company doesn't just take care of its profit, which it's supposed to do, but also takes care of our air and our water.
Or there will be repercussions. Is that what you're saying?
There will be repercussions for all of us and for all the other living beings on this earth. And so part of what we need to do is say, as citizens, what do we want our government to do? And what we want our government to do is protect us from the externalities. And that means regulate the big, powerful corporations so that they can make profit, but it will be less profit if they're also saving the air and the water and the ecosystems for the future.
You do talk about vehicles. What about this whole EV, electric vehicle discussion? Are you on board, or is there change that's needed there too?
The EV discussion is complicated because there are so many alternatives coming on at the same time. There are alternatives of batteries that don't require the most toxic metals, that don't require nickel and manganese. As a matter of fact, if you look at the Ford Mustang or the big truck, the F-150, they're using batteries that are relying on iron, which is much more plentiful, much cheaper, and much less toxic than nickel. And if you look at Europe and you look at California, they're also looking at fuel cells. So yes, we need to move away from oil. Everybody will agree. But there are more than one path. And when we think about the paths, we need to also think about the water. And we need to think about, do we need to mine, or do we first recycle all the metals that we have in our junkyards, in our landfills?
Do you have a sense, any stats on what that could give us right now?
The last time I looked at it was a little while ago, but there's a federal database that looks at how much more recycling we could do. And we're recycling in America about 30-40% of the copper we could be recycling.
Wow, so there's a whole amount of copper out there we could recycle, reuse, and maybe prevent some of this contamination and destruction of the environment.
And that's where we need to start first. We need to start first on the least damaging thing, which is to say, consumers, you need to tell your government you want to pay a little extra so that whatever big company, American or foreign, they actually take back your product and they don't put it in some landfill someplace. They actually make it so you can break it down and reuse the metals.
Because right now, our favorite phone company, our favorite whatever machine or whatever we're watching things on, playing things on, they aren't necessarily saying, oh, and by the way, when you're done with this, bring it back. Free recycling, or for $1, we'll recycle it.
Absolutely. And also, there isn't any government supervision. So even when people say, yeah, bring it to us, we're bringing it back, that could be ending up in a landfill in a foreign country rather than ending up, we're going to take it back as manufacturers and reuse it. So there's a lot that can be done in the short term. And then the other thing is, if there's going to be mining, there has to be, what I've seen over the past 14 years is a complete dereliction of duty on the part of government in terms of protecting air, water, health, and the rights of indigenous people to exercise the treaty rights that the United States government promised.
And various parts of the country are dealing with treaty rights, different sorts of issues that were legislated or agreed upon a long time ago. And I guess every cycle of leadership looks at that and sometimes wipes it out, correct?
I know better about Minnesota, but Minnesota, I know about the Anishinaabe people, and we call them Ojibwe or Chippewa, and usually in English talking. But they had a huge amount of territory, and they didn't consider it theirs. They considered a place where they would harvest the wild rice, they would fish, they would hunt, and their lives would be sustainable.
Kind of sustain the land, it will give us benefits, but we don't own the land attitude.
Exactly. And then the United States government said, we'll give you these little reservations. And the condition of that is that you will always be able to hunt and fish and gather in all the other territory, the ceded territories that you had sovereignty over and you're letting us use. And what's happening, if you look at mining, is if the water is dewatered or contaminated and the wild rice dies and the fish die, then it's not possible to exercise those treaty reserved rights. And for low-income rural people, they live sustainably also. They rely on hunting and fishing and gathering wild rice or tapping maple syrup in order to have decent food for their family and healthy food.
And it even doesn't have to be in rural parts of our nation. I live outside of Minneapolis, not that far, And there are lakes in the Minneapolis area, and when I'm out running, I regularly see people fishing those lakes. Now, I don't know if that's all the food they're eating, but it's happening even in cities.
That is such a good point, because when I was a city council member in St. Paul a long time ago, what we learned is there were some groups of people from Africa, people from Southeast Asia, Hmong people, who actually use sustainable fishing as a very big part of their protein. And one of the rivers in Minnesota that is reputed to be clean is the St. Croix. There's now a proposal for nickel mining throughout the region that is not only the headwaters for the Mississippi, but the headwaters for the St. Croix. And these are rivers that people fish. And one of the big worries about copper nickel mining, especially in the Midwest, is increasing the amount of mercury contamination of fish. And that is something that is so dangerous, because especially when women eat fish during their lives, that mercury gets stored in their bones. And it's during pregnancy, the fetus gets an increased dose of that mercury, or when a woman is nursing, the baby does. And this is a real danger, not just, we can't have what we like to do as fish, but looking at the developing brains of fetuses, infants, and children, and how they can be adversely impacted by pollution, which may be miles away, but comes downstream through the aquatic life and through the fish. So when we're thinking about mining, it's really important that we realize that water is connected. The water that is 5 miles away from you or even 100 miles away from you is connected, and it can affect the lives and the health of people in all of our communities.
All right, so Paula, now that you've thoroughly scared us and future generations, we on the Crisis Files do also like to give hope when we have thought leaders, experts like you, with us and educating us, enlightening us. What is some hope you can give us on this front?
Well, I think one of the big places where I see hope is that more tribes are exercising their sovereignty in the area of air and water. And the United States Environmental Protection Agency over the last 10 years has made it less difficult for a tribe to get treatment as a state. And so we're seeing also, I think that's a really big plus. Actually, in Minnesota, the Polymet mine is a proposed copper nickel mine, and they needed to get a petition from the federal government to destroy almost 1,000 acres of wetlands. And it was the work of one of our tribes, the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, that resulted in that permit being thrown out, being revoked, because the mining company and the state and the federal government hadn't adequately considered how it would impact the downstream tribe's water quality. So that's, I think, a very big positive. The other thing is I think more people are talking about water. And they're talking both about water quality and about water quantity. In Minnesota, for example, I would say 10 years ago, people took water for granted. Maybe in some parts of the country that are dry, that awareness had happened before. But I think throughout the Great Lakes and in northeast part of the United States, there's becoming an awareness that we need to think about the quality and the quantity of our water for our future. And I think that is changing the way we look at mining, changing the way we look at agriculture. I think you have to start with the awareness first, and then you get the government policy. The government reacts to what the people are feeling. So the more people are talking about protecting the water quality, protecting the water quantity, do we need to do mining at all? Can we do agriculture better? I think that's a big potential for hope.
All right, well, we will continue to hope. Thank you to Paula Maaccabee, one of Minnesota's Attorneys of the Year and General Counsel for Water Legacy, a nonprofit nationally recognized for its environmental stewardship and effective advocacy. Learn more about their story at waterlegacy.org. Today's Crisis Brief is brought to you by Gulf Public. Number 1, educate yourself on water resources in your state. Knowing where these resources are and how they are connected can help you understand if and how they might be threatened. Number 2, work to understand the choices we make going into the future. How you interact with the environment now impacts all of us for years to come. Number 3, get involved. If you are passionate about an issue, talk with your legislator. Volunteer for an organization, write letters, or donate. You are not powerless. Your voice does make a difference. Reputation issues can arise quickly and unexpectedly. Prepare and plan before a crisis strikes with Gulf Public, an award-winning public relations and public affairs agency. Your best defense is a crisis-ready culture that helps you spot potential issues, act swiftly, and reflects your brand's values while building trust with your audiences. Learn more at golfpublic.com. Thank you to podcast producer Kim Inslee and audio engineer Tom Hamilton. Rate, review, subscribe to The Crisis Files on your platform of choice. Check out our new website, thecrisisfiles.com, to catch up on all case files. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at The Crisis Files. I'm Roshini Rajkumar. Join me next time on The Crisis Files.